and welcome to Rising. We have a great show for you today. I'm Amber Duke, joined by Nomiki Konst. Nomiki, good morning. Good to see you again. Absolutely. Happy Friday.
11 days, 10 days, how many days?
I think 11 days, actually, that we are out from the election, and the final New York Times Siena College poll is out as well. The poll found that Vice President Kamala Harris and former President Donald Trump are locked in a dead heat. Harris and Trump both are tied with 48% of voters. The Times says Trump has done well on immigration, while Harris has done well narrowing the gap on voters' trust in her on the economy.
Harris was in Georgia last night alongside President Obama and Bruce Springsteen, who did not hold back on Trump. Let's watch.
Donald Trump is running to be an American tyrant. He does not understand this country, its history, or what it means to be deeply American.
Trump, meanwhile, was in Arizona last night where he said this about our country.
Right, and we're a dumping ground. We're like a garbage can for the world. That's what's happened. That's what's happened to we're like a garbage can.
Trump's running mate J.D. Vance was in Detroit where he did a town hall with News Nation. Let's take a look.
If you're discarding a lifelong friendship because somebody votes for the other team, then you've made a terrible, terrible mistake and you should do something different. Like, don't cast aside. Like, most of my family obviously is going to vote for, Donald Trump and J.D. Vance. And if they're not, actually, I need to talk to them. But I've got friends who like me personally, acquaintances who aren't necessarily going to vote for me. That doesn't make them bad people. And we can't, this is my most important advice, whether you vote for me, whether you vote for Donald Trump, whether you vote for Kamala Harris, don't cast aside family members and lifelong friendships. Politics is not worth it. And I think if we follow that principle, we'll heal the divide in this country.
All eyes will be on both candidates over the next coming days as Trump will appear alongside podcaster Joe Rogan today, while Harris will be alongside Queen Bee, Beyonce, tonight in Texas, and will also be interviewed by podcaster Brene Brown. This is pretty crazy. I mean, the gender gap is stark, as we know, but the campaigns are not holding back and showing that the gender gap is strong. Beyonce showing up in Texas. Texas is interesting right now because you do see Ted Cruz and Colin Allred, Representative Allred, really neck and neck in a state that I think Democrats had wrongfully blown off for years. And now you see that they're within the margin of error. Mitch McConnell has held back funding. Ted Cruz has complained about not receiving funding from Mitch McConnell for whatever reason that may be. And I think it's smart for Kamala Harris to show up with Beyonce of all people in Houston and on Brene Brown's podcast, which is, a heavily female audience. I think they're just really leaning into that base at this point.
Yeah, I think that's true. And Trump is trying to widen his margin with men. And the question, of course, is who's going to have the bigger margin that can overcome their opponent's favor with one gender or the other. I'm interested in Texas, too, because I do see that the Senate race is very close. If I had to guess, I would say Cruz might win by 2 or 3 points, just based on what I've seen from the polling so far. But I am curious if it is a good idea for Kamala to be working on these down ballot races when she could be potentially in a swing state for the presidential amid a very, very dead heat.
I think, listen, the polls are definitely close, right? They're close across the board within the margin of error in every single battleground state and even in battleground bellwether districts, congressional districts, Senate districts, as you would say. With that being said, there is another play here in that Texas is also ground zero for the most restrictive abortion laws in the country, and that is a key theme in the campaign. I do think that she has the opportunity to lean into states like Florida, Texas, North Carolina that maybe a cycle ago or several cycles ago, in the case of Texas, were on the map. We're seeing some stuff on the ground that I think is transformative. I think the electoral map is going to be very different on November 6th, maybe 15th, we don't know. Whenever we find out the election results, I think that the map is going to look very different than what it has in previous years. So she's going to use it as an opportunity not just to rally the forces in Houston and with Beyonce, where she's from Houston, but also to talk about these restrictive abortion laws, which is a narrative that resonates around the country. And that's also what's happening in Texas with Colin Allred, is that because of these abortion laws, so many women in Texas, including Latinas, for the first time in history, are moving more pro-choice. So that might be the factor in Texas. it's probably going to be the factor if Kamala Harris were to win, which I think is going to happen across the board, is that you're just seeing abortion is such a moving topic because it's not just about pro-choice at this point. It's about what comes next. We didn't think that this was actually going to be on the table, and now it is. And so what comes afterwards?
Yeah, I mean, we do know that the economy and immigration are still the top two issues, although abortion is usually in number three compared to those. I was initially very critical of Kamala's decision to go to Texas, and then Tim Walz going to Kentucky to lobby on behalf or against the school choice measure that is being voted on. But then you see Trump doing a Madison Square Garden event and campaigning in places like New York and California. So I think what they're both trying to do is bring salience to the issues that benefit their ticket, even if it's not necessarily in a swing state where they need to whip voters. And we'll see if that pays off for either of them come Tuesday. One thing that I think will pay off is Trump doing this Joe Rogan interview. This is the #1 podcast in the world, millions of viewers on every single episode, and he's doing it just about a week out from the election. I think the episode is supposed to drop either this weekend or on Monday. I mean, talk about the gender gap. This is a hugely influential podcast with men in particular. It's very independent-minded. Joe Rogan has not endorsed either candidate. He says he's been sort of a Bernie Sanders fan in the past. I mean, what do you think? Should Kamala have gone on Joe Rogan as well, or do you think the Brene Brown podcast is enough to offset it?
You know, I think that Kamala Harris should take every opportunity, and we don't know what happened at the end of the day, why the decision was made, if it was on her end or their end, or they were negotiating certain terms. I mean, there's so many factors at play here. With that being said, you know, Brene Brown this is about base at this point, and I think if they know where their numbers are with young men in particular that, you know, under the age of 35, I don't even know if Donald Trump will win the margin he needs. I mean, turnout is everything for everyone at this point. So I don't know if she can sway those listeners at this point, and those who would be swayed are probably already tuning into other podcasts and aware of where she is. I mean, this is again about undecideds, and it's about motivating a base. That's not her base, and she's speaking to undecideds in other places. So I think both ends right now are focusing, at least on the podcast side, on moving their base. And Brene Brown, you know, and the other side of this is young men are, unfortunately, not as reliable of voters, and we don't even know if they're, I know registration is up, but we don't know who the registration is up with, if it's with young men, if they're going to turn out after they're registered. I mean, there's a lot of to overcome in terms of moving a voter from being unregistered and having no experience in voting into getting them to the polls, especially with an unreliable group of voters.
Yeah, we do know that the Republicans have eaten into the Democratic registration advantage in places like Arizona and Pennsylvania. On the topic of, you were mentioning, sorry, I lost my train of thought.
It's okay. Women.
Yeah, women.
No, I mean, it's
oh, sorry,
yes.
you were talking about turning out the bases.
Yes.
I was kind of surprised as well to see that just about a week and a half ago that Kamala Harris decided to launch this Hunters and Anglers for Harris Walz. And I thought that was a little strange to do that this late in the election cycle, especially as we see outdoorsmen, generally speaking, tend to be Republican.
I mean, some of that is Tim Walz. Tim Walz knows that base because he is that base. He understands that it's not necessarily a partisan issue to be an outdoorsman. Maybe there is some, I don't know, there's probably no polling on this, to be honest, but there's probably generalized conceptions of what it means to be an outdoorsman. But he's from Wisconsin. He's from Minnesota. He knows the Rust Belt states and I mean, he was talking about how he has guns and he goes out and he can outshoot anybody.
Yeah, but then he totally blew it because they did that pheasant hunt and he couldn't load a shotgun.
What do I know about that?
I don't know.
I mean, you know who else can't? Dick Cheney.
Well, that's also fair, and he's supporting Kamala Harris. So we have a lot more topics to talk about on Rising. We'll be back right after this.
We are just under 2 weeks out from the election and still without an endorsement from the Washington Post. Post staffers are reportedly blaming Bezos, Jeff Bezos, the owner, for the delay, according to independent journalist Oliver Darcy. It's believed the editorial board has already written its backing for Harris, but has not gotten the green light to publish it from Bezos and the editor-in-chief, a former Murdoch employee. Insiders reportedly speculate that Bezos, who has yet to speak publicly about the 2024 election, does not want to alienate former President Donald Trump. The paper supported Biden in 2020 and Clinton in 2016 and published those endorsements much earlier in the cycle.
It all comes as the LA Times editorial editor resigned this week after billionaire owner Dr. Patrick Soon-Shiong prohibited the paper from making an endorsement, as it had for every presidential race since 2008. Soon-Shiong explained the decision in a lengthy post on X, writing, quote, "The editorial board was provided the opportunity to draft a factual analysis of all the positive and negative policies by each candidate during their tenures at the White House and how these policies affected the nation. In this way, with this clear and nonpartisan information side by side, our readers could decide who would be worthy of being president for the next 4 years." Instead of adopting this path as suggested, the editorial board chose to remain silent, and I accepted their decision. Please #vote. So it seems like the era of the newspaper endorsement is kind of fading. Back in 2022, we saw a similar move from papers owned by Alden Global Capital, such as the Boston Herald, the Orlando Sentinel, where they decided that they weren't going to do any endorsements whatsoever. I guess the question here is, are the billionaire owners exerting their own influence on the editorial board and not allowing these papers to retain their editorial independence?
I mean, I think so. It's pretty clear. The LA Times editor, editorial board editor, resigned, as we stated, knowing what happened internally. There was an incredible report out in The New Yorker a couple of days ago by Susan Glasser about the billionaires backing Trump. And it's fascinating because many of the billionaires that are coming together to back Trump were actually outspoken about not supporting him after January 6th, but it seems like they all had some sort of meeting where they came together, far-right billionaires all the way to, centrist, probably center-left billionaires who would have supported Hillary Clinton and did support Hillary Clinton. They are coming out and giving millions and millions of dollars to Donald Trump's super PACs and to Donald Trump campaign. The Blackstone CEO, Steven Schwartzman, has been one of the most vocal. Nelson Peltz, he came out against Donald Trump and is now all there. John Katsimatidis is a billionaire in New York, but he's conservative, very conservative. Steve Wynn, Mary Madison, the typical ones. But it is interesting to me that a lot of these billionaires, not all of them, do have investments in China. And so that was one of the things that came out in these reports, is there is a concern about the Biden-Harris administration's role in cracking down on some of the, obviously, China's actions towards the United States recently, but also just some of their trade policies, which are really to focus more on manufacturing in this country. And it's interesting because Donald Trump does rail against China, and his whole tariff game, which we all know is not something that's doable, is a play to the base. But the reality is that he's incredibly pro-China, incredibly pro-business, and wants to continue to have tax cuts for the billionaires, which he provided, of course, in his administration, and Biden is very opposed to.
Well, Trump did institute the tariffs on China that the Biden administration continued, right?
Those are minor tariffs, but it's a bad policy. He wants to economists across the board say this is a bad policy. It's going to increase prices.
But I guess my point
in the country.
But my point is separate from the economic impact of it, which we could debate all day.
Yeah.
But that you say that Biden is the one who's been tough on China and that Trump has just been giving lip service, but he's the one who instituted the tariffs that the Biden administration is still using to this day.
And I don't agree with that. And, they should reverse that policy, but he wants to go even further.
But isn't that tough on China? To make it more expensive for them to export goods?
I think it would be... Joe Biden has been so adversarial towards China, vocally
How
adversarial.
So?
Well, first off, it is to be speaking outwardly as considering China as an adversary. For the Biden administration to explicitly say that, we saw what happened with the balloons that were being spread, the Chinese balloons that were going across the country and how they were spying. The fact that our intelligence community has repeatedly called out China for their actions in the Philippines because against international law, Chinese boats have been brushing against Philippine boats in Philippine water. I mean, that is an act of war, essentially. I mean, this is not something that I think is disputable. Tariffs, continuing tariffs under the Trump administration tariffs, I think that's a wrong move. It's hard to reverse. I don't understand why they're making that decision, but I don't think that the tariff move on Trump to increase those tariffs is smart for anybody but China.
Let me
That's
pose
what we
this
have to
question
keep in
to you
mind.
as well. Why do you think Secretary of State Mike Pompeo was in the process of defunding Confucius Institutes in the United States because they were found to basically be spy centers for the Chinese Communist Party at universities. Why do you think the Biden administration decided to reverse that move and continue fully funding them?
Well, I don't think that any of them are fully funded by the United States government, so let's make that very clear. Having tax incentives is very different, and you can't just rightfully release tax incentives. That's a long process, and that sets a precedent for other universities, including Catholic universities and Catholic schools. So just keeping that in mind, that we do have separation of church and state, and you can't just pick who you want to receive tax incentives or not. And it's not that we are fully funding. The only schools that we fully fund are public schools, fully fund.
Right, but I'm saying the government gives money to Confucius Institutes.
How so? As tax incentives?
No, they actually fund them.
That's fundamentally
Through public
untrue.
universities.
They're not public universities. Confucius Institutes are private universities. They're funded by.
They have within public universities. They have Confucius Institutes as part of the campus.
That is
The same way you would have like the let's say you have like the Bill Ackman Center for Free Speech at Harvard as like a made-up example. That's the way the Confucius
private
Institutes.
institution.
Okay, well then at the
public-
University of Maryland, okay, as an example, you have these centers, right, that are funded as part of the university. That's what the Confucius Institutes are as part of the university system in the United States.
Are you sure they're not So first off, if they're CCP backed, that would be a national security issue, and most
Agreed,
likely,
and that's the issue. And so that's why Secretary of State Mike Pompeo was moving to defund them, and Biden said, no, we're not going to do that anymore.
Are they funded by the CCP, or are they funded by the United States government? And Mike Pompeo, by the way, has blasted Donald Trump on his China policy and has blasted him on his foreign policy. And he's parading around Europe right now talking about that and raising the alarm for European leaders that Donald Trump is not only in cahoots with China and Russia, but that they should be alarmed by his actions. So, if you're going to talk about Mike Pompeo right now, he's not necessarily the defender of the Donald Trump China
Well, certainly
policy.
he didn't move to defund the Confucius Institutes without the approval of Donald Trump.
I think what we need to understand, it's one thing to make a claim, but I need you to tell me where in the line item does it say that it's funded? Just making a claim that something's funded, that's a vast claim, and we know that in every single institution, there are private donors, especially with a public university, but if it's CCP funded, then it's not US funded.
It can be both.
How is that the case?
Okay.
No, you're putting the burden on me, but I'm putting the burden back on you to prove it.
Yeah,
because
okay.
You can't just throw it, moving the goalposts.
This has been well reported. I'll find the source for you.
In conservative publications, which have a questionable,
right, because the mainstream media has a great track record.
Well,
That's
we have
why.
fact
And let's get
checkers.
back.
We have fact checkers.
Conservative media doesn't have fact checkers. Have you ever worked at a
I just
conservative
don't
media
understand.
outlet?
We're moving
Let's
the
go back
goalpost here. We're moving the goalpost.
How are we moving the goalpost?
Because we're talking about Elon Musk, and we're talking about
you said that
Jeff
Trump.
Bezos.
You said that Trump wasn't tough on China, and I challenged your claim. That's not moving.
That wasn't Trump. That was Mike Pompeo, and it was based on a claim that only appeared in conservative publications in which you can't even explain.
You said you didn't even know about it till I told you about it 30
because I don't read
seconds
far-right
ago.
conspiratorial media.
Okay.
That's why.
It's been reported in the Wall Street Journal, but I guess that's
then
far
what
right to you.
happened? What
But
happened?
nonetheless, let's go back to the editorial board endorsements, okay?
Yes.
Because we've obviously gotten off topic. But do you think these even matter? That's I mentioned trust in media is at an all-time low. Does it actually even help a candidate for them to endorse them? Maybe it hurts them because a lot of Americans, for good reasons, don't trust the mainstream media anymore.
Well, I think the people that are reading the newspaper tend to be more center-right to left, and so it could make a difference when you have somebody who's undecided who reads the paper every day, especially local papers. People still, whatever remaining local papers exist, people still read them for their rationale and their reasoning. Then it also gets picked up in the media and becomes a conversation topic. So I do think it's incredibly powerful when the New York Times makes an endorsement, when the LA Times makes an endorsement, when the Washington Post makes an endorsement, but all the way down to the Texas Tribune, to other papers around the country. Because in the morning, people wake up, they read their newspaper, physical form, on their phone. But again, that's for a certain type of voter. A more educated voter, a more informed voter, a more media savvy voter. And if they're not endorsing, that's actually more of a signal. And I think that the billionaires are losing the narrative here, in that it makes them look bad, like they're putting their thumb on the scale of democracy by weaponizing, the free press at this point.
And I guess my pushback to that would be, wouldn't that be a good thing that the billionaires don't want to use these papers that they have purchased as a means of influencing voters?
I don't think that's influencing voters. I think newspapers have a long tradition of making endorsements, and billionaires are, it's not their role. They're not the editors. I mean, Jeff Bezos said he's not going to get involved in editorial. Well, what's happening right now?
All right, we're going to leave it there. We have a lot more topics to cover today on Rising. Stick around. Uh-oh, Charlamagne Tha God is not happy with CNN. Things got heated between him and anchor Anderson Cooper last night. Let's watch.
That president is a fascist. That's talking about putting people in camps. That's talking about, once again, terminating the Constitution to overthrow the results of an election. That's talking about, jailing his political opponents. Like, that rhetoric doesn't scare people?
Well, we talk about this every single. This is what
I don't think
I've been
y'all
talking
talk
about this every night.
I don't think y'all have enough conversations about it. I feel like I heard more on this network about is Kamala Harris black than I do about Donald Trump being a fascist.
Well,
am I wrong, Angela?
Honestly, that's bullshit. I'm sorry.
Oh, I like that.
That's
Go ahead, Anderson.
I'm not. Look, I'm a huge fan of yours.
Okay.
But to say that we're sitting around discussing is Kamala Harris black,
I've seen that. I've seen those
that's
roundtable
definitely
discussions
on.
a lot. Now,
That's
that's
true.
bullshit, Anderson. For you to say that y'all don't have those conversations.
I've never asked somebody is.
I'm not saying
Kamala
you.
Harris
I said
Not
the
you.
network.
He said the network. He
I
did
don't
say
think
the
anyone
network.
I don't think any anchor on this network has been going around saying, is she black?
Y'all have never
It's
had
definitely,
we have
been,
had. Look, I'm sure we have had, nutty people or people who have strongly held beliefs who I may disagree with, who somewhere on some panel have said something, but I will just speak up for what I do on the show. I do believe it's important to get people different viewpoints as long as they're willing to have a legitimate conversation.
Charlamagne goes on to say Trump isn't being treated like a threat to democracy. Let's watch.
I think no network has honest conversations about Donald Trump. Nobody's had honest conversations about Donald Trump since 2016. I saw last night they were talking about, the double standard that exists between Donald Trump and the vice president. But it's always a double standard with Trump, whether it's with Hillary, whether it's, against Biden, now with Kamala. We talk about him being a threat to democracy, but we don't treat him like one.
I don't know what you've been watching, but I don't know of any Trump supporters out there or people who like him who are tuning in to me every night to try to get, to be validated in their opinions.
Over on Fox, Stephen A. Smith joined Sean Hannity's show, where he also called out the host for the way he was covering Trump. Let's watch.
Number two, I know you're not talking about somebody being lucid and cogent and enunciating their thoughts with clarity, and you're bragging about Donald Trump. We can't be watching the same stuff if that's what you're doing. You ain't going to do that today.
You know
now,
what?
Lindsey Graham, hold it. Now, Senator Lindsey Graham is about to come on this show.
Let me tell you
now,
something.
that man can articulate himself very well. Not Donald Trump now.
I have sat with him for hour after hour after hour, topic after topic after topic, and he is so dialed in.
Really?
Look, it's funny. People try. This is like the latest argument. And meanwhile.
All right, let's start with this testy moment between Anderson Cooper and Charlamagne Tha God. I gotta say, I actually feel for Anderson Cooper for maybe the first time in my life. I don't think it's CNN or any news network's job to be spending the bulk of their airtime telling everybody that Trump is a fascist.
Well, I don't think that's what he was necessarily saying. I think he was saying that there was an unequal coverage, the way that the Daily Beast, 2 weeks before the election, decided to do a spread on Kamala Harris's style and that her pantsuits were out of style, rather than focusing in on, the fact that Trump's rhetoric has escalated towards the authoritarian tactics. Fascist or not, that's not their job to say, but they could report on it and say, this is unprecedented. It is unprecedented for a president to call, to go after his enemies and call them the enemies within and use the military against them. It is unprecedented for him to call to round up immigrants across the country, legal and undocumented, using the government resources. It is unprecedented to talk about body parts of a golf star on a stage. I mean, every day he's escalating things just a little bit more, whether it's delusional commentary or just really egregious rhetoric that is concerning towards the democracy of this country. I mean, I think that's what they're trying to say, is they're treating the two like they're equal. Like when Kamala Harris makes a gaffe or she loses her train of thought, that's the same as saying we're going to use the military to round up my enemies and undocumented people.
I mean, but they have to cover both campaigns, right? And it's not their job to editorialize, or at least it shouldn't be. And I think it's kind of weird, the assertion that places like the Daily Beast or CNN are somehow too nice to Donald Trump when these networks consistently have 90% negative coverage. I mean, there's a study from the Media Research Center that shows the 3 broadcast networks, NBC, CBS, and ABC, have been giving Trump 90% negative coverage since he first became a politician in 2015. So if you're going to say like, okay, well, 90% negative against Trump and then 10%, let's say probably 5% of that is negative towards Kamala, that somehow is them being equal, I think it's actually the opposite.
I think I'd be curious how this conservative research center is stating whether or not something is negative. What is negative? That's definitely, I mean, these are news networks, so I don't know what negative coverage means, but also Donald Trump puts it on himself. When he goes out and blasts his enemies and insults them, and then they literally quote him and report on it, that's him doing it himself. Kamala Harris isn't out there calling to murder her enemies, so of course she's not going to get that coverage.
When did Trump say he was going to murder his enemies?
Well, he's saying that he's going to use the military to round them up. All I'm trying to say is the rhetoric that he's using is being reported on, and he's doing that for a reason, because he wants to escalate the conversation and rile up his base because he can't expand his coalition right now. But that's at the detriment of really a smart, fair campaign where we should be debating ideas. And he's not. He's not debating at all. He's not debating ideas. He's not debating at all. And it's concerning for the state of media in this country.
I think you haven't been watching a lot of Trump if you say that he doesn't debate ideas or talk about ideas. I mean, there is a reason why voters say they need to know more about Kamala Harris's policies, and yet they seem to know exactly where Trump stands on the issues.
Well, Trump is, I've been watching Trump. You can't get away from Trump. Trump is on all day long, whether you want to listen to him or not. Second thing is Kamala Harris, voters aren't saying that anymore. The undecided voters that are about 1% that are saying that they need to know her ideas. There are people now making decisions about whether or not her ideas are something they want to stand for, or they're going to stay home. That's really what's coming down to these undecided voters, which is a small segment of the population. And she's been running for 3 months at this point. And so he has been running for the last 10 years. We know what he stands for. That doesn't mean they're ideas. We know what he stands for. He's not proposing any policies other than tariffs at this point, and rounding up undocumented people.
Well, he did propose ending taxes on tips and ending taxes on Social Security, both things that Kamala robbed for her campaign.
Okay, those are 4 ideas, but he still doesn't have extensive plans. He's been running for 10 years. He wants to bring manufacturing back, yet he had the opportunity to do so. In his administration, he didn't. The economy under his administration was worse. That's when inflation peaked. And so, I think he's running around in circles, escalating the conversation because he can't expand the base past the MAGA movement. And the MAGA movement is what is responding to this escalated conversation. I just don't understand how that's going to play out at the polls.
Well, you said that he didn't bring manufacturing jobs back. Prior to the pandemic, manufacturing jobs were up 150,000. They only dipped after the pandemic.
Not a lot, by the way. That's not a lot, Amber. That's not.
I agree. It's not a lot.
He said it was going to be, several millions.
Well, I agree. It's not a lot, but it's more than have been created under the Biden administration. And inflation did not peak under Trump. It
began under Trump.
Right, but it didn't peak under him. It peaked under Joe Biden at 9%. Still above where it was when Biden took office. It was at 1.9. And then you say Trump's not expanding his coalition. Why is he polling better with blacks and Latinos than any Republican president in modern history?
Well, the polling for blacks and Latinos is not actually better. It's at the numbers of 2016. They're comparing it to 2020. And yes, he is doing a little bit better with Latino men, but that does not mean he's winning with them. Just because he's polling a little bit better with men in all demographics, that's not really expanding a coalition. That means he's just getting a few more men. Expanding coalition is, bringing the Republican Party back, bringing those never-Trumpers back, winning with Republican women. For the first time in 24 years, Democrats are doing better with a conservative base, older voters over the age of 50 who are R plus 13 voters she's winning with right now. If I were Donald Trump, I'd tone down the rhetoric in these last 10 days, like his advisors have advised him, so he could win a few more votes. Because it's just the coalition right now is depending on the least reliable voters, young men.
I just think it's interesting. The Democrats used to always celebrate having young voters, and now they're celebrating having old voters.
We're also winning with young voters, Democrats.
But the margin has been reduced pretty substantially from the past 2 elections, right?
However, the majority of young women, by far, historically, they've always voted for Democrats, but the metrics are much higher now for women under 35, and they're more reliable voters than men under 35. So this is a real problem for Donald Trump, and I know that he knows this, otherwise he'd be expanding the coalition right now.
Final point on this, and a question for you going back to this media coverage with Charlamagne Tha God and Stephen A. Smith. I mean, do you think that their strategy is really helping, though? I mean, they want to basically lecture voters about how evil Trump is. We've seen historically that actually has the opposite effect. People tune out from that because they've heard it all before, and they've already seen what Trump did in his first term. A lot of these claims that it's unprecedented are obviously not true. I mean, Abraham Lincoln suspended habeas corpus. We had a president literally put Asian Americans in internment camps, but we're bellyaching over deportations. Like, I just don't find it comparable at all.
Donald Trump also wants to reinstitute the Alien Sedition Act, which is alarming, and we should have learned from that. I think what they're doing is not lecturing voters. They're talking to the media saying, you can do better. You can do better in this moment as we're leading up into the election where you are they're sick of reporting on Trump. I think that's what's really happening, is that the opposite of Trump derangement syndrome is happening, is that the media does not want to talk about how this rhetoric is escalating as we near an election, and they're giving whole segments to Kamala Harris's, gaffes, which every presidential candidate has a gaffe. If you listen to Donald Trump's speeches, it's all gaffes. It's going off into weird tangents about things that he sees in the sky. I mean, it's never on topic. And I think what Charlamagne Tha God is saying is, you have a moment in this final stretch to really refocus and remind folks what's at stake here, because whatever side you're on, that's what voters are thinking about. They're not thinking about the day-to-day gossip.
All right, we're going to have to leave it there. We have more on Rising after this.
A new United Nations report reveals that female athletes lost almost 900 medals to transgender athletes competing against them in women's sports categories. The report found, quote, over 600 female athletes in more than 400 competitions have lost more than 890 medals in 29 different sports.
The wide-ranging report was created by Reem Assalam, the UN Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women and Girls. The report put blame on the international federations and national governing bodies for policies that allowed born males to compete in women's categories. Al-Salam further noted that male athletes had specific attributes, including higher strength and testosterone levels, that can be advantageous and result in, quote, loss of fair opportunity for female competitors. Plus, Al-Salam argued that testosterone suppression did not make competition fair. Specifically, she wrote, quote, this approach may not only harm the health of the athlete concerned, but it also fails to achieve its stated objective. Therefore, the testosterone levels deemed acceptable by any sporting body are, at best, not evidence-based, arbitrary, and asymmetrically favor males. Al-Salam argued that open categories should be created for sports to ensure both fairness and inclusive participation.
Unrelated to the trans issue, Al-Salam found female athletes are also subject to other forms of violence when it comes to sport, including physical abuse, pervasive sexism, exclusion, and limited access to training facilities and resources. So the second part of this report was actually a majority of the report, and I think it's very important to emphasize that. But this is one person's report. While it was reported at the UN General Assembly, let's be very clear, this was not something that the General Assembly concluded or voted on or made some statement on. It is a report that happened within the UN. With that being said, there's been some issues in terms of some of these reports being influenced, especially with the Olympic committees, by Russia. And there's been a lot of pushback in that Russian Federation, angry that they have, especially in the Olympic community, have been ostracized and pushed out for several reasons, violating the rules when it comes to steroids and pumping their athletes with an advantage. They're acting out by funding sort of rogue organizations that appear to be totally universally accepted with these reports that are flawed. We know what the facts are here. You have women in the Olympic Committee coming out, Billie Jean King, Brooke Ford, Megan Rapinoe, Erin McLeod, Dwayne Wade. These are folks who are saying this is not an issue. This is a small group of people. And to also lump in middle-sex people, which are not trans, who have a higher testosterone, it's really not impacting. This is a manufactured debate that is there to influence and rile up and put fear into folks, but the majority of women who are athletes do not buy into this. Now, are there a few that are vocal and concerned? Sure. But again, the IOC has said over the NCAA has allowed the trans community to compete in sports for years. But now suddenly, the Russian-backed group is issuing their own reports and raising alarm. It's suddenly in the mainstream.
What is the evidence that Russia has influenced this United Nations report?
I didn't say so. I think we have to take everything into consideration.
I mean, you mentioned their influence supposedly on the Olympic Committee, but I mean, that begs the question, why did the Olympics allow two supposedly intersex athletes to compete at this past Summer Olympics, even when Russia was complaining about it? I mean, that would suggest the opposite of Russian influence. And it's not like the United Nations is exactly like a far-right group, right? It's easy for athletes, by the way, to say that they support transgender participation when they've never had to actually compete against a biological male. Megan Rapinoe comes to mind as an example of that category. And you say it's not a big deal, it's only a small handful of people, but the whole point of this UN report is that it has numbers. Over 600 female athletes in more than 400 competitions have lost more than 890 medals in 29 different sports. This is clearly more pervasive than we've been led to believe.
But that's not because necessarily they have more testosterone or not. You know, to make an assumption because somebody is potentially trans or middle sex, again, very different, or LGBTQI, we don't really know because sometimes they don't even have to disclose whether or not they're trans. So the report seems a little loosey-goosey with the facts, making assumptions that certain folks, like we saw this summer with the Russian committee, that stated there were 2 boxers who were trans who were not. I mean, we have to be very clear about these things if there's going to be vast assumptions. I mean, that's why the IOC called out these Russian-backed groups that are trying to influence the conversation, because they're not based in evidence, they're not based in science, they're not based in actual statistics, and they're using the conversation around trans people, women in sports, to rile up a base and anger folks and divide them. And I'd like to know where this, I mean, this was...
Why would the United Nations be trying to rile people up about transgender?
It was, they allowed somebody to testify at a report. So there's a difference between the General Assembly listening to someone and the General Assembly voting on something.
But she was assigned by the UN to do this report. So why would the UN assign her to do this, to rile people up? What is the UN's motivation?
So the UN, when they say go research something and come back,
right?
Studies can be complicated and detailed. So she issued a report, she testified, but they have not said that they agree with it or not.
So do you think she was trying to rile people up?
I don't know. I need the evidence is what I'm trying to say. That there are a lot of numbers put in here that seem to be assumptions because we know that many athletes do not disclose whether they're trans, whether they're middle sex, because especially with middle sex, it's personal information. And it's not something that a UN report is going to have access to. I mean, that violates personal privacy laws.
Well, it does say specifically transgender athletes, but then I'm also curious, you say it's without scientific evidence. I mean, every biological study available to man indicates that higher testosterone levels throughout puberty influence a person's athletic advantage, right? Because it's not just the testosterone level that indicates whether or not someone's going to perform better. Even after their testosterone levels are suppressed, if they've gone through puberty as a man, they have longer wingspans, they have greater lung capacity, greater heart function. These are all things that contribute to a man having a competitive advantage over a woman.
So I have endometriosis. I have higher testosterone. I'm a woman.
Okay.
Does that mean that I have an advantage over sports because I have endometriosis?
The difference is that you're talking about a comparison of kind versus a comparison of difference. So when we're talking about biological men, they have on average a higher testosterone grouping that any woman would have even if she has slightly escalated or elevated levels of testosterone.
What about middle sex? Middle sex are not men. They have escalated forms of, they have escalated testosterone. Does that mean that they're not to be included?
I mean, generally, yeah, I actually think so, because they do have the XY chromosomes, or excuse me, the male chromosomes. And when they go through puberty, they tend to have testosterone levels that match a biological man as opposed to a woman. So I do think their inclusion is unfair.
Well, I think that, everybody has a right to have their role in society, and everybody should be able to compete in sports. And if you're middle sex in particular...
Right, and they're offering a separate category for people who don't neatly fit into the male...
Separate... Okay.
Yeah, it's a category for transgender athletes to compete.
And the minority
What's wrong with that?
of people want this. Again, this is not something that is overwhelmingly popular in society.
It is, though. In the United States of America, the majority of people surveyed on this issue say that they do not think men should be competing in women's sports because it's unfair and unsafe.
They say it needs more research.
That's okay.
Well, there's
I'll find
a difference between more research and being absolutely against, trans people competing in sports.
They're against it, and I'll find the poll for you.
But the IOC, most importantly, the IOC, the NCAA, they've had trans athletes, and there's never been a problem until suddenly.
There has been a problem, though. I mean, Riley Gaines testified about her experience competing against Leah Thomas. She lost out on a state.
Recently, as I said, until recent years, when it is used as a cultural issue of division in the culture wars, suddenly it's an issue because. I mean, but this is true.
But there was no indication that transgender people were allowed to compete in sports until recently. So at the same time they were allowed to compete is when it became an issue.
When people started to discuss it. We don't, again, privacy laws. Does somebody have to disclose whether or not they're middle sex? No, they have privacy laws. So when the Republicans decided to talk about bathroom bans, 12 years ago, suddenly this conversation, by design, I think the right wing has used as a wedge issue by talking about a minority and putting fear in multiple communities and making it dominate conversations. But the reality is that this has occurred for years, and the IOC knows that, and they've stated it, and it has not been a problem until it suddenly became a cultural war issue.
All right. I would suggest that the female volleyball player who has permanent brain damage after being spiked in the head by a man would disagree with you. We're going to have to leave it there. We have a lot more topics to talk about on Rising right after this. In a newly unveiled campaign ad, the Democratic National Committee is going after third-party candidate Jill Stein. In the 30-second ad titled "The Company They Keep," the DNC lumps Stein in with former KKK leader David Duke and links her to Trump, his former lawyer Jay Sekulow, and other MAGA allies, as well as Russian President Vladimir Putin. Let's watch.
You can tell a lot about a person by the company they keep. Like Jill Stein. Stein isn't sorry about swinging the 2016 election to Trump, and now she's being helped by MAGA allies and Trump's former lawyer. Longtime Klan leader David Duke endorsed her, and like Trump, she's cozied up to Vladimir Putin. Jill Stein, look at her friends, because a vote for Stein is a vote for Trump. Just ask Putin.
Jill Stein, I like her very much.
The ad comes after Duke endorsed Stein last week, and he said he carefully considered the decision, saying it was the most important statement he's ever made politically. Stein, of course, disavowed Duke's support. In a statement about the ad, DNC senior advisor Mary Beth Cahill wrote, "Jill Stein, David Duke, and Vladimir Putin may make odd bedfellows, but they all have one common goal: to beat Vice President Harris and put Donald Trump back in the White House. We all know Stein helped hand Trump the White House in 2016. She had no regrets, and she wants to do it again." Kamala Harris seems scared, as I pointed out on X, and I wrote, quote, "Spending money on this 2 weeks out indicates the campaign has deep concerns about retaining the progressive Dem base. If that's true in Wisconsin, the problem is likely even deeper in Michigan."
This is not the first ad the DNC released targeting Stein. Just 14 days ago, they published an ad doubling down on the claim that Trump allies are helping her derail the Harris campaign. Here's that ad. Let's watch.
Jill Stein, Green Party candidate for president. So why are Trump's close allies helping her? Stein was key to Trump's 2016 wins in battleground states. She's not sorry she helped Trump win. That's why a vote for Stein is really a vote for Trump.
Jill Stein, I like her very much. You know why? She takes 100% from them.
Stein was somewhat of a spoiler in 2016, pulling in 132,000 votes in 3 key states: Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania, and we know how close that was in 2016. This cycle, she could throw a wrench into the works too. National polling places her at 1%, which could be more than enough to make a difference. According to the latest Suffolk University poll, the race is essentially deadlocked in a 5-way ballot among likely voters. Harris is polling at 45%, Trump at 44%, Cornel West, Stein, and Chase Oliver hovering at 1% each. Stein is on the ballot in almost every state that matters, and she has already said she ain't going anywhere. Well, I know that the DNC started this group in March to address third-party candidates, knowing that there was an issue in 2016 with these battleground states, and how, folks on the left can sometimes act out. I understand the sentiment in many of their reasonings, and especially with Gaza right now, I think folks are rightfully very concerned and frustrated. But math is math, and I worry that while you may not have everything with the Kamala Harris administration, she is an extension of the Biden administration. I understand. She's not in the room making decisions. She's not the commander-in-chief. With that being said, the difference between Donald Trump and Kamala Harris when it comes to Gaza is stark. I mean, Donald Trump was instituted the Muslim ban. Donald Trump's family has discussed developments in Gaza. They have openly been incredibly pro-AIPAC and pro-Netanyahu, whereas the Biden-Harris administration, yes, they continue to fund Israel's arms, although they may not if Israel does not provide humanitarian aid. They are still challenging Netanyahu's policies. But Jill Stein, on the other hand, has no record with the Green Movement. She has been called out by nearly every environmental activist, including Bill McKibben. She has been called out by her own kids to not run for office. I mean, this is something that should be concerning, and the DNC has every right to put out ads against folks that stand in the way of winning an election.
They certainly have the right to do it. I guess the question is if it's a wise strategy 2 weeks out from the election where you have this sort of lingering uncommitted vote, particularly in states like Michigan and Wisconsin, right? I mean, I can't imagine that those people who are upset with the administration's policy on Israel are going to feel warm and fuzzy all of a sudden because they've lumped Jill Stein in with David Duke. If anything, that would make me less likely to vote for Kamala because I feel like they're trying to assassinate the character of a candidate that I like and who supports my policy on the Israel-Gaza war. And Kamala has said repeatedly that she was the last person in the room with Joe Biden in all of the major decisions of this administration, and has also said publicly that she is going to continue Biden's policy on Israel, which they might have been paying lip service to the idea that they don't like what Netanyahu's doing, but they continue to fund him, they continue to send him weapons. They haven't really imposed any consequences for what they say is this awful behavior. They haven't called it a genocide, and we've seen some progressive members of the progressive Democratic base responding to phone bankers saying, well, until there's an arms embargo, then I'm not voting for you. And the phone banker argues back and tells them that a vote for Jill Stein is a vote for Trump. And maybe that's true, but I also think it's a little bit arrogant to assume, for Kamala to assume and for Hillary Clinton to have assumed in 2016 that all of the people who voted for Jill Stein would have voted for her, because it would essentially require that entire 1% that voted for Jill Stein to go to these candidates for it to change the outcome of the election in those states. We know that third-party candidates are not that cut and dry, right? Sometimes they don't vote at all. Sometimes they go for the candidate that you wouldn't expect. Some of them could vote for Donald Trump. I mean, we don't know that. So to insist that this was the difference for Hillary Clinton, Jill Stein, this is the spoiler, I don't think stands up to scrutiny.
I think they were saying it was a contributing factor. I think that listen, I was on Bernie Sanders' 2016 campaign. We were fully aware of the mistakes and we warned about some of the mistakes in advance that Hillary Clinton were to make, like, I don't know, opening up an office in Wisconsin or being pro-fracking when we saw that the issue was resonating in states like Pennsylvania with progressives that they needed, and that only less than 1% of the jobs in Pennsylvania are, far less than 1% are fracking jobs. So we saw that there were voters that would have been inclined on certain issues, TPP, for instance, that could have swayed the election. The office in Wisconsin being the biggest one. With that being said, it was very clear that the Stein voters, as few as they were, percentage-wise, were leaning more progressive. In this situation, I think that it's probably going to be fewer, far fewer than 2016, but the margins are so small. And, Kamala Harris is pro-ceasefire, and she does have, she is definitely more progressive, I think, in history when it comes to Gaza than Joe Biden. But she's in a difficult situation in which she's part of the administration. She doesn't want to challenge Joe Biden's history and legacy, but she also needs to have her own positioning. With that being said, we cannot deny the fact that Jill Stein, went to Russia, sat at the table with Vladimir Putin, and Michael Flynn for the RT dinner. This is a woman who has no experience in foreign policy, who is a Massachusetts activist, a perennial candidate, who really had very little experience in the progressive movement at all, including the Green movement. And she met with them, then decided to run for president, shocker. And now she's using right-wing consultants, has spent over $100,000 alone on ballot fights to keep on the ballot in certain states with MAGA consultants. I mean, she is absolutely being propped up by the right, and it's concerning. And I think that, yes, voters should look at that. I don't think that they're passionate about Jill Stein's policies. I think that they're acting out against administration. And I would just say, think about who you're voting for, because your vote matters. I'm not going to advocate for anybody to do anything, but she is a weapon being used by the right, and that's very clear.
Well, we will see what happens with her support in just a couple of weeks. We have a lot more to cover on Rising. We'll be back right after this. Just in time for the presidential election, Steve Bannon, or the founder of MAGA, as some would say, will be freed from federal prison next week. He was jailed after he refused to testify in front of the January 6th committee. He was charged with contempt of Congress. Bannon had hoped to spend the final 10 days of his sentence in Washington, D.C. under home confinement, but that request was denied.
Bannon predictably slammed the Harris-Biden administration, falsely claiming he was detained illegally. The far-right site, the National Pulse, published a statement from Bannon which said, quote, "Kamala Harris is the queen of mass incarcerations, detested by Black and Hispanic men who are refusing to turn out and vote for her. She has done nothing to implement President Trump's heroic First Step Act, in fact, welcoming hundreds of thousands of hardened illegal migrant criminals while allowing U.S. citizens eligible for early release to rot in prison." To discuss further, we have Benjamin Teitelbaum, author of War for Eternity, a great book, inside Bannon's far-right circle of global power brokers. Welcome to Rising, Ben. So, okay. We're expecting Steve Bannon to be released on Tuesday. Let's cut to the chase. Do you think he's going to jump right into the campaign and start advising? And what do you expect in this final, frankly, week of the election?
I don't think that he'll start advising. His tools, you could say, of influence have always been networking and communicating. And what I would expect is for him to jump back onto his podcast, War Room, and that there'll be a significant amount of buzz around his opening words. But we've seen throughout these past years that Trump and the people closest to Trump have been friendly to Bannon. They might have met with him in private, but they haven't wanted to have a public association with him that much.
And what is the reason for that? I mean, I know that there was some bad blood after the first Trump administration. What was it that kind of led them to decide to distance themselves, at least publicly?
Well, that's what you just mentioned is part of the reason. The two men at the top, Bannon and Trump, do not get along well together. And having spent a lot of time with Bannon, I think I can understand why. The two of them are huge personalities, huge egos. The thought of being in the same room with both is quite a harrowing prospect. But I think that there's also a political and a strategic calculation that says that they're not really going to expand their base through Bannon. Bannon exists in order to deepen convictions. He's there to speak to the more uncompromising, the more radical wings of the Trump coalition, to keep them motivated. And at this point, they are motivated. So Bannon's real interventions, I think, could come later, after the election, whether that leads to a Harris victory or a Trump victory, in terms of trying to prepare the Republican Party and conservative American politics to be more in the form of, let's say, J.D. Vance or Josh Hawley, as opposed to Mitch McConnell.
Ben, in your book, you talk about this network, this global network that Bannon has been very involved in. You know, not just, if people recall, he started this monastery to train the far right in Europe. That monastery was in Italy for the EU elections. Of course, he was behind the Brexit campaign, very involved in that. But beyond that, what I find really fascinating about the book is you get into the psychology and some of the spiritual aspects of what informs Steve Bannon in this global coalition. So right now we're seeing reports almost daily about how Russia and other foreign adversaries are influencing our elections in different ways through misinformation. Today, Elon Musk, there was a report in the Wall Street Journal about how Elon Musk has been in discussions with Vladimir Putin for the last couple of years. Can you give us a sense about what his role is right now, especially since he's been in prison, in this sort of global coalition to back MAGA, I'll say, not even Donald Trump, just MAGA in general.
Yeah, he's been reaching out. There've been a couple motivations behind his global campaign. One of them has been China. He's believed that if we redrew our map of alliances, we might come up to a place where the United States could lead a more formidable coalition against China's global interests. The other part of this has been, though, that he has also wanted to see the United States withdraw from its role as a sort of global police, as he would put it, a global police force, and also to not see the dollar be the currency of the world, because he doesn't think that serves the United States. And so he's been working on these campaigns for a long time. The problem is this, though, Nomiki, is that I think he underestimated it, is that some of his allies in Europe in particular have not had the same analysis that he has had of Russia. He is basically, and I've had a number of conversations with him about this, and I've quoted it in my book, he basically thinks that Russia is a Western nationalist Christian state, very much in the model of Europe, and therefore that Europe ought to be in some sort of alliance with Russia. Much of Europe, including much of the far right in Europe, does not agree with that analysis. And when the Ukraine war came about, we saw a split take place there. So that was a sort of deep-seated problem with his plan. The other part of this, though, is also that Russia and China are close. They've gotten closer. This alignment between China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran has only deepened. And so that global campaign, kind of the way that he had set the table for himself, has been scrambled. It was scrambling before he went into prison. It's happened more since in these past 4 months. And so it, just as an observer of Bannon, someone just looking for things that are curious, I'll be interested to see exactly how he analyzes and wants to move forward in this new changed geopolitical landscape.
Just going back to domestic politics for a moment, what is Steve Bannon's thought process on Trump's choice of J.D. Vance to be his running mate? There were obviously more sort of traditional establishment Republicans that were being floated, like Tim Scott, for example. And then Trump angered a lot of the establishment Republican Party by choosing J.D. Vance. Does Steve Bannon sort of see him as a potential torch carrier for MAGA beyond Trump?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, that's the thing, is I was asking myself, how is he going to react to the scene when he exits domestically? I think J.D. Vance is going to be the thing that excites him the most. He was worried, and he said this to me, he said it to other reporters, that one of his biggest concerns was Donald Trump himself, and Trump's tendencies toward moderation, his tendencies toward equivocating, to negotiating, to simply being influenced by the last person who was in his ear. And so he was worried about MAGA becoming less MAGA over time. And J.D. Vance emerges as someone who would push back against that. He's a hawk on immigration. He's a hawk on Ukraine. People have different opinions in this country about how much money should be given to Ukraine, for example. We disagree about that. Relatively few people took as staunch a position on Ukraine as J.D. Vance did so early, and he has been so consistent with this. So Bannon will be thrilled with that. I think he'll also be thrilled with the way that Vance performed in this campaign. He had a rocky start, no doubt. His negatives are very, very high, no doubt, but he performed quite well in the VP debate. And that surely is going to boost enthusiasm for Vance within the Republican Party, and that's what Bannon cares about more. That's more his strategy. It's not about building broad coalitions. It's about deepening the convictions among the faithful. And so yes, that's where a future for Vance would come in.
So this is interesting to me, because I would have actually thought that J.D. Vance was a little bit too mainstream with the Heritage Foundation Project 2025 alignment. I would have thought for someone like Steve Bannon, who's populist, a little bit rogue, he wouldn't fit in with the more traditional, even traditional conservative types. So moving forward, Trump's elected, not elected, J.D. Vance is definitely the torchbearer of the party. How do you think Steve Bannon is going to integrate with the new realignment of the Republican Party, which includes Heritage Foundation, Project 2025.
Yeah, I understand the point that you're making, no doubt. I mean, Heritage has changed quite a bit as well. I know we think of it as being this beacon of Republican establishment, but it also is moving in a much more populist direction. And not just that, but it's also investing in the potential role that government can play, a sort of government interventionist role, opposite, let's say, a more libertarian model of anti-government. It's just that they want the government to do the specific things that they want it to do, not that they're opposed to government per se. And so those ideas that are coming out of Heritage, Project 2025, those things aren't as much at variance with Bannon as we might think. But your broader point is true. Bannon is moving into a different type of coalition. Some of the opinions moving here are ones he likes and some he doesn't. I think the bigger clash is not with Heritage per se, it's with Silicon Valley. It's with Elon Musk, it's potentially with Peter Thiel, David Sachs, those actors. Bannon is a nationalist. You could say that he's a nostalgic. He's a religious conservative in his own way. All of those things are not quite as obvious in Silicon Valley. There's an emphasis on the ability to move capital and people around to compete on a global level for talent, for goods, for the ability to escape regulation and things like that. And there's not a drop of nostalgia to be found in a politics of nostalgia, in a politics of the past golden era. That doesn't meld very well. Now, J.D. Vance bridges the gap between these two worlds, being at once supported by Bannon, a hawk on immigration, nationalist, but also coming from Peter Thiel's sphere, and that might give him a longer life within this movement. But it's still a problem for someone like Bannon.
Oh, really interesting. Ben Teitelbaum, thank you so much for joining us this morning on Rising.
It's a pleasure to be with you. Thanks for having me.
Elon Musk has been cozy with Russian President Vladimir Putin for years, according to a bombshell report in the Wall Street Journal. The paper spoke with several current and former U.S., European, and Russian officials who confirmed that Musk and Putin speak on a regular basis. Their conversations have ranged from personal topics, business, and geopolitical tensions.
The article also reveals that Putin allegedly asked Musk to avoid activating his Starlink satellite internet service over Taiwan as a favor to Chinese leader Xi Jinping. U.S. officials raised national security concerns over the rumored relationship between the tech mogul and one of America's biggest adversaries. Musk, who holds top security clearance, has contracts with NASA and the Pentagon, a relation that would almost certainly be fortified if Trump returns to the White House. Elon Musk, Russian agent.
I mean, it's concerning that he has top security clearance and contracts and has intelligence when it comes to our national security plans, given Starlink. And of course, NASA, too, is part of that, his relationship with the NASA program. Yeah, I mean, it's concerning that not only is he having conversations with Putin, an adversary, but that he's not even telling U.S. officials that he's doing so.
Well,
do you think so?
I agree to an extent that it could be concerning. I don't think that this report is the bombshell that it's being made out to be. For one, I want to know more about the sourcing. We have several current and former U.S., European, and Russian officials. I want to know what several means. I want to know how many of each official. Is it one of each for 3 officials? Why are we relying on the word of Russian officials? That's a little bit concerning. And not to mention, there have been past stories led by intelligence officials in the national security state that have turned out to be wrong. 51 of them, of course, signed that letter claiming that the Hunter Biden laptop had all of the evidence of being a product of Russian disinformation. So, I mean, and also, of course, going back to 2016, they accused Trump of colluding with Russia to win the election. So I think people are very skeptical of these sort of Russia fear-mongering narratives that come out of the national security state. And all of that being said, the sort of smoking gun that they're trying to run with here is that Elon Musk must have acquiesced to Putin's request to avoid putting Starlink over Taiwan. But we know, because the negotiations were borne out very publicly, that it is actually Taiwan's decision not to move forward because they have a law that requires that any company that operates there has 51% ownership by someone in Taiwan, right? So Elon Musk obviously wasn't willing to cede 51% of the ownership of Starlink, and that's why the internet service didn't go forward, not because of anything that Vladimir Putin said.
Well, he's been in conversation, according to sources, and one of them is Ian Bremmer. That is one source who's come out and said that he did have a conversation with Elon Musk he's the president of the Eurasia Group, that he had a conversation with Elon Musk at a conference in Aspen. And this is after some of the sources, of course, are administration folks, are people in the Russian government. It's not necessarily against Russian interests to verify this, but one of the people that Elon Musk has been speaking to is the deputy, he's the deputy chief of staff to, first deputy chief of staff. They have the first, second, third deputies in Russia, I guess, under Putin, Sergei Kiriyenko, who has been in constant conversation with Musk, but this is the person who put out 30 different website domains to spread disinformation about Ukraine. You know, Elon Musk owns X, which is a huge facilitator of Russian disinformation, so much so that Elon Musk, this is very concerning, that he posted the Ukraine peace plan, Ukraine-Russia peace plan, which was almost identical to the one that Moscow put out. It's one thing to say the national security state was not able to provide enough evidence for certain things. But Russia doesn't necessarily need evidence to spread disinformation campaigns. It doesn't mean that they were behind the Hunter Biden laptop situation. It's that they were spreading it throughout the internet to cause divisions. And that's something that's part of their strategy. They find something that's true or 1% true, and they put bots and disinformation networks out there to sow division. And that's hurting our national security. I don't think you would disagree with me on that disinformation campaigns definitely influence folks.
To an extent, although what happened in 2016 was we found out later that the extent of the so-called Russian disinformation campaign was wildly overblown. The impressions that they received on Facebook, for example, were much lower than we were led to believe. And I think the other question involved here is, what was Elon Musk talking to Vladimir Putin about? It's not uncommon for international business leaders to talk to international leaders as they are either implementing a service or selling a product to that country. We know similar things have happened with Apple CEO Tim Cook, as well as Mark Zuckerberg, the CEO of Meta, in talking to Russia, China, etc. Those conversations are not uncommon. The question is, were they talking about national security issues or things that are sensitive to the United States? And based on this Wall Street Journal report, it doesn't sound like they were, because about 8 paragraphs down, they kind of bury the lead and say that these officials did not indicate that there were any national security concerns from Musk's conversations. And you have to assume that every time he's talking to a deputy of Putin or even Putin himself, that those conversations are being recorded, right? They know exactly what those people are saying.
Well, Putin does. I mean, we don't have any knowledge that the U.S. was recording Elon Musk. But also, again, it's not necessarily. First off, they did have conversations about situations like Ukraine and Russia, and that's concerning. They had a conversation whether or not Taiwan chose to not use Starlink or not. They still had a conversation saying that Putin was asking him to not use Starlink above Taiwan as a favor to his ally.
Yeah,
China.
And I will say that claim in particular has less sourcing than the general claim that the Wall Street Journal article makes, that they were speaking on a regular basis. I believe that Taiwan claim only has one unnamed source, which is shouldn't really pass journalistic muster.
Well,
maybe it was 2, but I mean, I guess the question for me is, like, would you have equal concern over Mark Zuckerberg going in person to meet with Xi Jinping and then asking him to give his child an official Chinese name? Also, Tim Cook had a very close relationship with the Chinese president. So I don't find this out of the norm with how we've seen other businessmen operate with international leaders.
Well, those businessmen did not have high-level security clearance, and they did not have they did not have contracts.
Well, Facebook had military contracts.
Not related to national. Did he have personally high-level? And I would be against that too, by the way. Anybody who has critical information about our national security state should not be having conversations with foreign leaders, and definitely not behind the back of the U.S. government.
Well, Facebook did have military contracts, and in fact, they were seeking additional military contracts with China, if I remember correctly, which is why people were concerned about Mark Zuckerberg's apparent.
As they should.
Yeah, and I think Apple has a relationship at least with the government to turn over information based on investigations. So
I just, again, I don't care who it is. If you have a contract in the United States and you have national security clearance, why are you having conversations with foreign adversaries and not telling the U.S. government and simultaneously echoing their positioning on key wars like the Ukraine-Russia war on your app? It's concerning. There's red flags all across the board here. And I think the Wall Street Journal does very good sourcing. Obviously this went through months and months of speculation and criticism internally. There was internal debate, as we're seeing. So I think it's important that we trust that Wall Street Journal did their due diligence.
And got it all borne out 2 weeks before the election. All right. Well, we will, of course, continue to follow this and see if anything else comes out about Elon Musk's friendship with Vladimir Putin. We have a lot more topics to talk about on Rising right after this.
Los Angeles County District Attorney George Gascon will seek resentencing for Lyle and Eric Menendez in the 1989 murder of their parents, paving the way for their release decades after being locked up. For context, in 1989, the brothers fatally shot their mom and dad, Kitty and Jose Menendez, in their ritzy Beverly Hills home after they allegedly endured years of sexual and emotional abuse by their father, a music executive. Each was around 6 years old when the pattern of repeated abuse began. Lyle and Eric were 21 and 18 when they committed the grisly crime.
The brothers were sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole, but now DA Gascon wants them to be resentenced. Here he is in a Thursday press conference. Let's watch.
There are people in the office that strongly believe that the Menendez brothers should stay in prison the rest of their life, and they do not believe that they were molested. And there are people in the office that strongly believe that they should be released immediately and that they were in fact molested. I have to tell you that after a very careful review of all the arguments that were made for people on both sides of this equation, I came to a place where I believe that under the law, resentencing is appropriate.
According to a 2023 California law, people between 18 to 25 years old are allowed parole. The Menendezes were under 26 years of age when they killed their parents. Gascon filed a motion Thursday asking that Lyle and Eric be resentenced to 50 years to life, which would make them immediately eligible for parole if the judge grants it. The case recently resurfaced following the premiere of the Netflix series titled Monsters, the Lyle and Eric Menendez story. A hearing date has been set. I know you've watched the movie, I haven't, so please fill me in on the history of these two. I understand that they claim that they were being molested by their father and that their mother knew about it and didn't do anything, and eventually they snapped and murdered both of their parents.
Yes, so there's the series on Netflix. There's now a documentary on Netflix, which I haven't watched, but there's also a documentary on Hulu. And in the documentary on Hulu, I think what's important to note is this started to come to light because of some folks on TikTok who, it's kind of comical, they first discovered the Menendez brothers and oh, they're really good looking guys. Which is concerning, but that was the entry point, right?
Women love killers, apparently.
So they said they started to go down a rabbit hole, and it wasn't just women. There were some guys also who started to go down this rabbit hole in learning, re-educating themselves. Most of these people were not even alive when this happened, and they re-educated themselves about this case. Now the case was incredibly complicated. It happened it was 1989, so it was before the O.J. Simpson case, but later when they were tried again, because there were two court cases. So the first one led to a hung jury, right? And then the second one, when the DA's office tried, they went down much harder, sort of in reaction to the O.J. Simpson criticisms that district attorney's office had in Los Angeles at that time. If you remember, LA was the center of everything at the time. So in that second case, the defense did not release the information about the molestation until the final minutes, and only a teeny bit was allowed in. And in that testimony, if you were to watch, the sons were so clearly distraught. It is hard to watch their testimony and not understand what they were going through. And then they were sentenced. And so there was some conversation at the time, but it seemed to me that a lot of the mess was created by the legal system, the DA's office, and that's probably why Gascon said some people in the DA's office who might have been around in the 80s and the 90s did not agree with his decision, but then others did because of new evidence that's come out. Also new evidence, just to throw this out there, in another reality show about Menudo, if you remember that group, that
boy band,
yeah.
Was
Ricky Martin was
Livin' La Vida Loca.
That's Ricky Martin.
Yeah.
So he came out of Menudo. So one of the boy band members, his name was Roy Rosselló. So he was one of the youngsters, and he actually claimed that he was molested by the Menendez father.
Really?
Because he was a music executive at the time.
Oh.
So that evidence is also brought into the equation, and it's been 35 years too. These folks have served their time, these boys. Not all of their families happy, but the majority of them are happy that this could occur. And also the claim at the time, sorry, just to dump everything on you, is they were portraying them as wanting the money from their parents, but there's also some questions. Yes, they went on a spending spree, but there's also some questions as to whether or not they were spending outside of their normal spending habits because the family was
very wealthy. Okay.
Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah. I mean, obviously it would have been hard to prove the molestation. It would sort of be like a he said, she said, but you would think that would factor into the sentencing at least, even if not brought up during the trial. And I understand there's been some pushback on the Netflix series because apparently they kind of portray a sort of incestuous gay relationship between the brothers that I don't know that there was ever evidence of.
And the adults, the brothers, pushed back on that publicly. So I don't know where that was rooted in, where that came from, but essentially they were saying that the older brother had gone through so much torture, essentially, by their father, and that when he learned about his younger brother, which is true, he became very angry. But then they made it appear that the older brother was then molesting his younger brother, and there's no evidence of that, as far as we know.
I mean, which to be fair wouldn't be uncommon as a victim of abuse either. But I hear music executive working with young boys, red flags start going off. I mean, Lou Pearlman, of course. And then on the TV circuit, Dan Schneider, there was that recent Nickelodeon documentary about what those kids went through. I would say it wouldn't surprise me. I have watched some of their testimony, and it was very hard to watch. You could feel the emotion coming out of them. And I think another interesting facet of this is that this was one of the first big sort of celebrity trials, so to speak, one of the first that was really televised in a way where it captured the nation's attention. And then you have OJ starting right after this first hung jury trial. I mean, I feel like in a lot of ways this probably changed the way we even consume information about the judicial process.
And the second trial was not televised, so that was another factor. I mean, the judge made a lot of decisions that I think, in retrospect, in 2024 probably wouldn't be handled that way. The way that the public discussed this case, it's cringy. It's very cringy in 2024 to see the headlines and how comedians at the time were making fun of them, and there was some information about the molestation, especially in that second case. But it's sad to see how we as a society talked about sexual violence, molestation, and if you want to go even further, how women were portrayed in the 90s and 2000s. I think we're having a real aha moment in society.
Yeah, and it's weird. I mean, when you think about it, you hear people talk about like your daughter gets raped and you go and kill the guy that did it. Should you go to jail? And most people are like, no, that's justice, right? Mm-hmm. And I would tend to agree with that. And so I don't think that this case is functionally that different from sort of that mindset. And I know a lot of states are now implementing laws that actually give sentencing breaks to people who are victims of some type of domestic abuse or sexual violence, who then go on to be violent against the perpetrator. New Jersey and New York, I think, both have a law stating that if you are the victim of some kind of abuse, then you still have to serve some time for overreacting, so to speak, but you get a break because you were trying to basically defend yourself, even if it wasn't a self-defense in that exact moment.
It's like it's still intentional. There's still, it's manslaughter, right? But it's a different form because it's, there is a mental state at play here. If you're traumatized, if if you're dealing with sexual violence for that long, repeatedly, and I highly recommend people watch the film and the documentaries, because it's alarming, and equally so is just how our justice system dealt with the situation. It's like we didn't really fully understand humans at the time. I mean, someone who goes through that sort of trauma, of course, is going to react and be mentally affected by it.
Well, 30 years later, more than 30 years later, it looks like they will be getting out. That's going to do it for us today on Rising. As always, be sure to like, share, and subscribe so you can get all of the content. And for those of you who like to listen while on the go, we are now available anywhere you listen to podcasts.